Hello and welcome to our October third-party roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, John Cassell, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and John will reach out after to answer those. And with that, John Cassell.
Hey everyone, happy Halloween and thank you for attending today's third-party roundup webcast. Today I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party applications that have received updates since the start of October. There have also been a number of security bulletins and advisories throughout the month, and unfortunately a handful of actively exploited issues that we will cover in depth. Before we jump into it, for most third-party applications, we have no idea when they'll actually be provided by their vendors. Most manufacturers have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, vendors like Microsoft have been using the second Tuesday of the month for well over a decade now, and some manufacturers have followed suit, such as Adobe, and we'll see that today. I also perform this webcast on the last Tuesday of the month to ensure that I can capture most of the month's releases. Fortunately, this month we're on the last day. Every so often, few days past before the month ends, I might have to kind of go back. And actually, we'll be looking at a few that did get dropped at the end of September. So it's not just for October today. Let's briefly as well discuss what a vulnerability is versus what a patch or an update does. And I typically go through this for every webcast. You may have heard this exact same kind of spiel every time, because I do want to make sure that everyone understands the kind of difference there between what we consider something that can be exploited versus what a manufacturer-specific update is actually going to provide. A vulnerability or a bug per se is a misconfiguration in a product. It could also be in an application, an operating system of any kind that, if exploited, would allow that product or system to be compromised by said attacker. A patch or an update is instead a piece of software or code published by that vendor of the product or the system to resolve the vulnerability. With that being said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. Many patches, in fact, are optional. We typically don't cover optional updates on this webcast, as I do want to, of course, focus on what is actually more concerning, but we will cover a number of other products that have received updates near the end of it, and most of those, again, don't have any type of advisory, but I just want to enlighten everyone on, of course, what has been released this month, in case those products appeal to you, as a consumer, or especially to your business. Also, if a vulnerability exists in a product or system and no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit, and especially if it is actively being exploited in the wild. Before we get into those latest updates, how do we prioritize them? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first is going to be the vendor severity. This typically ranges from critical severity to non-applicable, and comes directly from the manufacturer of the update. It is always important to check the vendor severity of any of the updates, and we'll be looking at a few examples of that today. However, also bear in mind that it can clearly be a biased rating. Many third-party updates don't receive severities from their manufacturers, as of course it would probably highlight the product or application in a negative light. And as well, a lot of them are proactively resolved before they actually get pushed into production. Happens all the time. To combat this, we instead prioritize the industry severity more, such as the CVSS score, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, calculated by an independent organization. This score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical. The higher the rating, it typically entails higher possibility of exploitation. Then we deal with the state of the vulnerability, such as being weaponized. You might also hear this being actively exploited in the wild. Means exactly that. It can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. And of course, there'd be proof to go along with that. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means that the structure, the blueprint of how the structure of the blueprint, how it's actually being exploited, from the attacker's perspective has actually been released. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's being exploited, although typically the two, weaponization and publicly disclosed, do go hand in hand for many vulnerabilities out there. But it does mean that the details are out there and how to weaponize it. So it's almost equally concerning. These are typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, or sometimes the manufacturer themselves. Countermeasures as well. It's a term that we use. You might hear a few other terms out there. It can be provided in two ways, either a mitigation, such as a configuration from an antivirus or an EDR that's stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying a patch. So it's more of a quick reaction to the actual exploit. And the other countermeasure is a workaround, which is typically more preventative, such as a registry, policy, or service configuration change that also prevents the vulnerability from being exploited. A great example of this is when Microsoft, and historically there have been many cases, unfortunately, they provide a recommended policy or registry change either for the operating system or the server role without the need to actually deploy an out-of-band patch. We saw this back in July with Office and HTML remote code execution vulnerability where they didn't patch it until August, so almost an entire month went by, but they did supply a workaround in the interim. Finally, the sixth factor in determining a strategy is the exposure, and this breakdown is based on whatever tool or solution is being used to detect and report on outstanding vulnerabilities across the device fleet. Every environment, of course, is different and typically includes various versions of operating systems, applications especially, and knowing where said vulnerabilities exist allows us to better target those endpoints for remediation. So jumping into it, the third-party products we'll be discussing today have all received updates since the month started, and again, all resolve some sort of vulnerability. Also, most products mentioned have some sort of advisory, with many actually receiving alerts from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to update as soon as possible. Lastly, before starting, if you've attended this webcast in previous months, you'll notice that we're going to do things a bit different today when covering each manufacturer's vulnerabilities. Rather than just leave it on a slide for a majority of the conversation, I'm actually going to bring up the vendors' websites. I'd like to take a deeper look in their advisories, and as well, you'll see a lot of comparisons in how the information comes from each manufacturer, and as well, the information that they provide from the vulnerability being tracked, such as how they produce information around the CVE. Some manufacturers essentially do it much better than others, and I wanted everybody to see that today. So we're going to go ahead and leave. Go to that slide in a few minutes. I'm going to go ahead and leave the slide deck. And the first one we're going to jump into today is Adobe. It's usually the first one always on my list. Adobe is, as mentioned earlier, one of the manufacturers that drops updates as well on Patch Tuesday. Would love to see all manufacturers do this so we can at least rely on when they're going to drop an update. Can't always be the case. Any manufacturer can drop something that is being actively exploited. So out of bands and 0 days are always a possibility. But aside from that, for your mainstream channel releases, it would be nice if we had a date to rely on for every single one of them. Fortunately, Adobe only does it once per month, typically, as long as there's not something major. And in this case, they dropped it on October 10th. There are 3 products that were updated: Adobe Bridge, Adobe Commerce, and Adobe Photoshop. First one we're taking a look at is Adobe Bridge. They had 2 important vulnerabilities. And as well, this entire advisory had a priority of 3. Now, if you've attended previous webcasts, you'll know that Adobe flipped the scale. Their rating system actually means that the higher the priority from Adobe themselves actually means it's less concerning. Priority 3 is what we want to see. Just means that updates have been dropped for typical vulnerabilities, but nothing is currently being exploited. There are no public details about it, which would lower the score, increasing the severity, which we have seen a few months ago. We saw priority 1 on a number of products. I like their advisories. It actually goes into detail about every version affected. It's not getting into full detail about every little piece of course, each vulnerability, how it's being actually exploited in a way, but does provide us a full breakdown of their products, which we'll see in a bit. There are some other manufacturers that don't do this too well, so I am definitely going to appreciate what I've got when I go to Adobe's page. There were only 2 important vulnerabilities for this product. a use after free vulnerability, and an out of bounds read issue. Both of them, if exploited, could lead to memory leak. Again, only important severity. Typically, I see them stamping critical on all of their advisories month after month. This product is not really all that affected. Both of them as well had a 5.5 CVSS score, which is near moderate, I would say. So actually going to go back a page. We're going to go to the next one, Adobe Commerce. And as again, all three dropped on the same day. Also a lower priority of 3. Products affected, or platforms rather. All of them are affected by this particular advisory. This release, however, did have a lot of vulnerabilities, most of them rated as critical. In fact, 7 of them, of the 9, were rated as critical, with only 2 important near the bottom. There are a number of different ways, or categories rather, that these vulnerabilities stem. So we've got improper input validation, cross-site scripting, improper authorization. I won't go through every single one of them, but I am actually going to highlight the ones that have the higher CVSS score. So that one at the very top, improper input validation, could lead to privilege escalation. It was rated critical by Adobe, so we are going to take their word for it. And as well, it does correlate as well with the CVSS score. A lot of the times, they don't. Adobe might say critical. If we scroll down the listing, and it'll have a lower score. Well, 7.6 typically to me is more of a high severity, but Adobe simply says critical and important. So their classification system as well will probably never match the next vendor. Critical, high, medium, low are your standards, but then many vendors out there will say recommended. They'll say important, moderate severity instead of medium. So reclassifying that is always slightly, well, I should say pretty important, especially when you're looking at one product versus the next. Going over to the last product, Photoshop. Probably I would say maybe out of these 3, the most widely used. It's definitely what Adobe is well known for, other than Reader and Flash. Photoshop also received an update, lower priority of 3. Does affect Windows and Mac OS, as well as I didn't mention it earlier, unless you saw it on the screen. Bridge as well also affects Windows and Mac OS systems. Only one vulnerability, so we won't spend too much time here, but it is a critical one. Access of uninitialized pointer could lead to arbitrary code execution. The typical impact I see on most Adobe advisories. So in this case, it is rather important, critical, of course. And the CVE as well. If you don't happen to see it, you can always scroll to the right here. The actual CVE ID has been provided. Again, only one vulnerability, but still pretty important. So if you are using Photoshop, do be ensure to update your product. So next vendor we're going to take a look at. I always follow suit in the same exact order. We're going to go and just Google it. Funny, because that's exactly what we're going to look at. Chrome releases. Now, I'm actually going to go back a few pages here as their release notes. One thing I don't like about it, it does just kind of throw it all into the same column. I can't quite filter for it. We're going to go back to not the beginning of the month. Unfortunate surprise for everybody. They actually dropped an update, I believe, on the same day of our webcast last month, so I was not able to highlight that particular version, but we are going to be looking at that today, and that was on the 26th. Oh, sorry about that, 27th. So looking at the 27th of September, and again, I know I wanted to talk about only October today, but I do want to always kind of catch up with where we were on our last webcast. Not a huge release other than, hey, it had a 0 day. It was probably the biggest release of probably the entire last month. And actually systemic as well. This is going to be referenced, this particular CVE, throughout every almost every other vendor that we'll be talking about today, unfortunately. This particular CVE 2023-5217 was actively exploited in the wild and does as well affect many other products. Taking a look at, just kind of looking at, there we go, the rest of the vulnerability information. Yeah, there are only 3 for this one. So the big one is really just that top one. This was provided by an external researcher. So actually there were a total of 10 fixes for this particular release of Chrome. 7 of them were not provided by external researchers and were not disclosed by Chrome, or sorry, by Google. This one also was non-applicable, so no bounty was actually paid out for it. Really minor release, in fact. What I typically see, usually in the 10, 20,000 range each release, if it's got over a handful or so. But this one did not actually have a payout. It's regarding a heap buffer overflow in VP8 encoding in a particular library, which was provided. If you watched our webcast, you probably see this name. This particular researcher has provided a lot of disclosure. Must have a pretty big wallet at this point with how many vulnerabilities he or she has been providing over the last many years now, actually, from Google's threat analysis group. I'll probably butcher the name, Clement Lassine. Hope that's correct. Has provided a lot of information. And actually, many 0 days of just this last year have also been provided by that same researcher. We are going to as well see this vulnerability pop up again in additional vendor advisories that we will be taking a look at regarding Chrome. This is the 5th 0 day of 2023. Pretty good compared to previous years. I think it was 16, 17, and 2021. Last year had 9. We're almost throughout this entire year, and to be only at 5 is clearly showing that it is, of course, maturing. 2021 was a really bad year, like many 0 days out there. And when it comes to Chrome and many Chromium-based browsers, they're all affected by those typically. Something to always keep in mind. So healthier year, but if you happen to be using Chrome, and although this is, of course, nearly a month ago, since we're catching up from last month's webcast, do make sure that you are up to date. And we'll be talking about additional products when we go through it. There was also an extended channel update for desktop. I didn't see it listed in the release notes, but I did mention it last month and as well in months leading up to today, that if you happen to be using Windows Server 2012 R2, just don't use Chrome, period. They're not going to support you any longer. Of course, that OS is now being phased out in general, but you might want to switch to something else. When we talk about Microsoft Edge in just a few moments, once we go through the rest of the release notes for Chrome, you will as well see that, probably should speed things up here. You will as well see that you'll have additional support for Windows Server 2012 R2. I would recommend to ditch Chrome. The advisory from previous months did say that it would be sunsetted as of this month. Going through a few additional releases, another one dropped on October 3rd, right here. Pretty minor release. Another type confusion vulnerability in V8. I don't know how many times I've said that now about the exact same vulnerability in the exact same JavaScript engine, but another vulnerability rated as high. This one, however, did have some pretty good payout for this researcher at $8,000. That's pretty good. But it's the only fix. In fact, usually I don't see it correlate. The only fix is also one disclosed. Usually I see a much higher number here. This one did line up. The next release was also on October 10th. We're going to skip all the other releases. We're mainly talking about desktop releases today, what would affect your compute device or on your server, in case you happen to be using Chrome on that. On the 10th, it was a much larger release. There were 20 total fixes, 14 disclosed by researchers, with 1 rated as critical, and a total of 30,500 in bug bounties. So we can count all of these up. It's a pretty good payout for a particular release. I've seen upwards of 100,000. Those are really crazy, but in this case, not that crazy, but still good payout for these researchers. So good job. Do see a lot of anonymous though. Moving on, there was another release on the 17th. Jump to here. Nothing disclosed, so we're not going to spend much time on it. 1 fix was provided most likely by the manufacturer. Nothing disclosed by researchers. Another one dropped on the 19th. Scroll up to here. Also nothing disclosed. This is actually for Mac OS only. So if you happen to be using Mac OS, just know on the 19th you did have an additional release, did not affect other operating systems. And the last release was on the 24th. Here it is. 2 fixes, only 1 disclosed by another researcher with a $3,000 payout. This as well is a high severity issue, so pretty big month for Chrome, I would say. Even though there weren't a lot of vulnerabilities per release, that's a about the average number of releases I usually see, over a handful. And given that, of course, there's a 0-day, this is one of the biggest releases of the entire year. So if you haven't updated Chrome, be sure to do so. This as well will affect other browsers such as Opera, Brave, and as well, the next one we'll take a quick look at, Microsoft Edge. We're going to go into Google, Edge release notes. This is an example of a manufacturer I kind of love and hate in terms of how they produce the vulnerability breakdown, and they do their release notes because they do a lot of redundant ones, even just for sub revisions. It's kind of confusing to know what exactly you might be affected by. But starting with, again, picking up from last month's webcast, very first one, we're looking at that same 0-day. CVE 2023-5217. As I mentioned, it's going to affect every other Chromium derivative. In this case, if you're using Edge, do be sure to update. There were 2 releases on the 29th. Not sure why. Didn't state much about it, but it is a slight revision increase. So maybe they had to fix something slightly as another release. Fortunately, Edge does typically update itself, so it's probably not a huge deal. But if you don't have internet access generally, it should be kind of concerning. Why don't have internet access, but you're using web browser, do you want to make sure you're still updated? The following next releases, not very important. On the 4th as well as the 6th, there were no actual fixes to highlight. Although on the 13th, it's a big feature release. There are new features dropped, as well as a huge change. The icon change in the Edge sidebar. It's now changing from the Bing icon to the Copilot icon. Look out for that. That's a really big deal. Kidding. There are some new policies as well. In this case, there were 8 new policies, 1 deprecated policy. Most of the new policies for administrators are centered, of course, in this fashion month after month for the administrators of the new features. And as well regarding that new Edge sidebar, the business banner, find on page, and we'll actually see as well that there are some new AI options within Edge. Moving on to the 18th release, another big change. They listed it again, which is again kind of slightly confusing when you're going through release notes. Again, they're letting us know about the Bing icon change to the Copilot icon. We really need to know that. Moving on to the 20th, no fixes to highlight. Oh, actually, I apologize. Going back to the 13th, there was an Edge-specific vulnerability. Spoofing vulnerability, lower score. This is one thing that I definitely wanted to show today, though. This is what I would consider kind of, again, that love-hate. This is the thing that I love that Microsoft does with their security update resources. It is listing pretty much every area around exploitation of the vulnerability. It is, again, within Edge, but it is Edge-specific, so it's not going backwards to say that this will also affect Chrome. It's an Edge-specific vulnerability. The things that I always like to highlight from here regarding the attack vectors and as well the exploitation. Most of the time when I see Edge-specific vulnerabilities, Microsoft has stamped it with exploitation less likely. But looking back to those factors from earlier, if it's being weaponized or it's exploited in the wild, or as well, if the public details are out there, it will increase exploitation possibilities. So always look out for that. Just to speed things up, there was another Edge-specific vulnerability on the 27th. It's Adobe specific. I didn't get a CVSS score from their information, but Microsoft did say it's a moderate vulnerability. Exploitation also less likely, but if you do happen to be using Adobe PDF in conjunction with Edge, be sure to update. That's probably all I'm going to focus on with Edge today. I'd like to move on to the next one, looking at Mozilla Firefox. So we'll quickly look at Firefox release notes. I have a manufacturer at the end of this call I definitely want to make sure I get to. Firefox has dropped quite a few since last month. There were 4 releases since the 26th of September. Unfortunately, one of those releases, like mentioned earlier, did actually focus on something concerning. And we look at the security fixes. If you ever go to Firefox release notes, I won't talk about new features because there weren't a heck of a lot. We want to look at the security side of things. CVE 5217 was also resolved within this release. I apologize, not this release, it's the next one. There were high severity vulnerabilities resolved in this one. It's actually the next release that we want to take a look at that was the most concerning. 18.01, the only thing clickable here is the security fix, and there's the critical. Again, by the same exact researcher. Not typical that we're going to see a Chromium vulnerability or release actually affect Firefox, because they don't generally use the same common code. but many, I would say, code projects or frameworks are shared amongst the two. And like we saw last month with the WebP vulnerability, this one is also affecting Firefox as it was disclosed in Chrome, again, affects Firefox too. So if you haven't been using Firefox and you're a few versions behind, if you're a few months behind, you have multiple 0 days that could affect you. So do be sure to update. Looking at some additional releases, I'm not going to cover this one too much. A few bug fixes. I typically see this with a lot of the sub revisions on Firefox and Thunderbird being the same. There were, however, a number of additional improvements and enhancements, I would say, to Firefox in the 1.19 release, just dropped earlier, just a few days ago, in fact. Firefox View includes more content. Gradually rolling out Fix 1.19, Firefox allows you to edit PDFs, a number of additional fixes, and the security fixes. This release did cover quite a few. There are 3 high severity, 7 moderate, and 1 low vulnerability for Firefox 1.19. I always want to check these before I start my webcast because I prepare a lot of this just the days before, but waking up in the morning before we start, I always want to make sure, is there a new release this morning? There always could be. One additional reason why I wanted to go through the release notes with everybody today. Another big release is going to be the Oracle Advisory. That's 2022. That's okay. There we go. 2023. There are a lot of products. Now, Oracle is what I would consider another manufacturer where we can guarantee its cadence. It drops quarterly. In this case, there are many products that have advisories from this huge manufacturer, Oracle. The one that I like to highlight today is going to be around Java. So we're just going to jump straight to it. It's not a huge release. I have seen much larger in the past when it comes to Java framework, but there were 5 vulnerabilities. The big piece here I wanted to get across, all of the vulnerabilities can be remotely exploitable without authentication. And one of them as well has a higher CVSS score, 7.5 for CVE 2023 30589. This will as well affect all other Java derivatives. Make sure that you're also updating Amazon Corretto, Adoptium, as amongst many others. Again, they're also going to be affected by this advisory. Another one before we forget, Video LAN updates. Don't want to go to news. I'm actually just going to click this link here I have. And it's a very interesting piece too. This is why I wanted to show this one. Their site is not even up to date in terms of the revision. So actually, VLC Media Player was updated at 3.0.19, although they say 0.18. When we go to the release notes, we can clearly see it is on a newer revision. And the concerning piece here, if you happen to use VLC, is regarding that same 0 day. 5217 does affect VLC Media Player as well as an additional vulnerability in zlib. So do make sure you're also updating this product. Like mentioned earlier, these 0 days can be systemic. There is an additional moderate severity bug with Notepad++. Won't cover that one today. We're a little short on time, but I do want to jump over to one of the big manufacturers that probably affects many of you today. I'm going to click the link. This would be Apple. Apple, well, I have to apologize to my audience, actually. Apple dropped macOS Sonoma last month on the day of the webcast, and I did not get a notification for it. So if you're noticing that I missed that on that, but talked about every other detail about Apple 0 days, I again do apologize. Last month on our webcast on the 26th, we can go down here, look at the advisory. macOS Sonoma was dropped. Also Safari 17, an updated version of watchOS, and an updated version for iOS 17 and iPadOS 17. There was, however, a 0 day, 2 actually, I apologize, 2 0 days between the 4th and the 10th for iOS 17 as well as 16 versions. You're going to see the same exact CVEs, so I don't have to click on both. CVE 2023 42824 and as well 5217, again, the same exact 0 day from earlier. So the same exact researcher from Google, and this one was also provided by another researcher. Both of them have been recognized as being exploited in the wild, so do look out for that. If you happen to have mobile versions, make sure you're also updating. Looking at some additional releases, a number of them dropped on the 25th of October for Safari, watchOS, tvOS, multiple versions, in fact, all supported versions of macOS, Monterey, Ventura, and Sonoma, and all supported versions of iOS and iPadOS. That means 15, 16, and 17. A number of vulnerabilities were updated in each one of these releases. No 0 days, which is good, because it has actually been a really concerning month for Apple products and Apple users. But I always like to flip that. If your manufacturer is resolving these and as well providing an advisory same day, respect that manufacturer. Even though there might be vulnerabilities, don't hate them for that. Things do get disclosed. Be more concerning if you had huge manufacturers out there that were not disclosing their vulnerabilities for one, but as well not fixing them. These as well have been fixed and resolved every single month this year. Going back to our slide deck real quick, we'll go ahead and finish this off. A few additional products that have received updates since the start of the month include Bitwarden, Cisco products with many CISA advisories, Dropbox, FileZilla, Foxit Reader, Genesis Cloud, iTunes, Jenkins, KeePass, Malwarebytes, RingCentral. I'm listing more. They're actually on the slide. Skype, Slack, VirtualBox, Cisco WebEx, WinRare, WinSCP, Wireshark, and Zoom. I hope that this has been informative and a slight change from our typical protocol on this webcast. Hope it's been informative, useful to everyone. And if you enjoy the form of this one versus the old one, let me know. If you want to go back to the old version or old format, I'm happy to do that. Please let me know. I do always want to mention that every day the Syxsense team identifies, classifies, and pre-checks various patches and vulnerabilities that affect common endpoints and servers. To get a full listing of all the various issues that may impact your environment, be sure to check out our website. Under our resources tab, you'll see a link to the vulnerability database. What I also love about the vulnerability library that we provide is that we not only discuss the level of impact like everybody else, but we also offer many recommendations and even resolutions for every issue. If you have any further questions, concerns, suggestions for improvement, please, we'd love to hear it. Thank you for your time. Happy patching and stay safe this Halloween.